Welcome back, everyone. Wanted to spend some time in the next couple days talking about Reconstruction, which is the next topic in our unit on discrimination towards African Americans. Uh, we have been before break and now talking about slavery and what that looked like. We want to now move into the post slavery period after the Civil War, talking about how this sort of unique period in American history, unique in a bad way, I would say, because it was so short, where African Americans have their rights protected, and what that looked like in terms of creating Jim Crow and segregation that you've learned quite a bit about in the context of To Kill a Mockingbird. When you see the word Reconstruction, literally, this is a period where we were reconstructing the country and putting it back together again after the Civil War, and that had a lot of different applications, but we're really going to focus mostly on the context of civil rights for African Americans in the post Civil War period in this presentation. Uh, One of the things that shapes this post Civil War period is the fact that President Lincoln is assassinated 5 days after the end of the American Civil War. And when Lincoln is assassinated, his vice president, who had just become vice president, becomes president. That man is Andrew Johnson. That's a picture of Andrew Johnson. Andrew Johnson was from Tennessee. That's a little unusual given that Tennessee was a country that had seceded from the United States. Andrew Johnson was a Democrat. He, however, and Lincoln was a Republican, obviously, but Andrew Johnson was a Democrat who'd stayed loyal to the United States even at a time when Tennessee had seceded. Lincoln made him the vice president for his second term in office because he wanted to show that Democrats and Republicans could work together, that he could have a Southerner on the ticket with him. He thought that would be a good symbol for how we were going to rebuild the country after the war and how we were going to make up with the South. Johnson was very much in favor of giving the Southerners amnesty. Amnesty is a sort of fancy word for forgiveness. He wanted to bring the Southern states back into the country quickly and sort of move on from the sort of horrors that we'd seen during the Civil War. So Johnson is of the forgive and forget, let's end the war, bring the South back, and go back to being one united country again. There's some evidence that Lincoln was sort of in the same boat before he was assassinated, but Johnson is definitely pro forgiveness of the South. The problem is that Congress at the time, which was only the northern states, was controlled by a group of people called the Radical Republicans. They did not want to forgive and forget. They were very upset about the Civil War and the way that the South had fought it. Many of the Radical Republicans believed that it was important to not be soft on the South, to punish them for their war against the North, and to use this as an opportunity to bring about equality for African Americans that many of the Radical Republicans thought the war was about in the first place. If you've seen the movie Lincoln, which just came out maybe about a year ago, was nominated for an Academy Award, like the central debate in that movie is between the radical Republicans who are pushing for the abolition of slavery and equal rights for African Americans, and other northern politicians, many of whom are Democrats, who are against that. The leader of the radical Republicans is the man pictured there on the left. His name is Thaddeus Stevens. Thaddeus Stevens was someone who was pushing for, he was seen at the time as very extreme. He was pushing for equality between blacks and whites. He wanted to give African Americans all of the civil rights that whites had, let them vote, let them get any job, go to schools, live with whites. This was seen as totally extreme in this time period. Very few people in the North agreed with all of those things. And you get this debate between the president who wants to go, quote unquote, go easy on the South, and the radical Republicans who want to punish the South and thus really stand up strongly for the rights of African Americans. And this is the main debate that takes place in the early stages of the Reconstruction period. Radical Republicans are upset that the first thing the Southern states do after the Civil War is pass black codes. These were new laws that said former slaves couldn't own weapons, former slaves couldn't go out at night, former slaves couldn't travel more than 5 miles from their home. All of these things trying to limit the freedom of the newly freed African Americans. And when the South passes these black codes, people like Thaddeus Stevens and the radical Republicans say this is exactly what we have to stop. This is exactly what we fought the Civil War to end. Initially, the first thing that passes in this Reconstruction period is the 13th Amendment, which is the amendment that bans slavery. And Johnson was generally supportive of that. But as soon as that passes, this debate between the radical Republicans and Johnson really picks up. The first big sort of flashpoint is something called the Freedmen's Bureau. African Americans were usually referred to as freedmen, newly freed men, and the Freedmen's Bureau was a new branch of a new department in the government whose job it was going to be to try to help freed men, to educate African Americans who had never been allowed to go to school, to give them some vocational training, some money to get on their feet and get some support. Because imagine what it would be like if you've lived your whole life in slavery and now all of a sudden someone says, hey, you're free, and you don't have the skills or anything necessary to go out into the world on your own and be independent. The Freedmen's Bureau was going to address that problem. President Johnson thought that was not necessary, so he vetoes that. The radical Republicans in Congress push that legislation because they think it's essential to carrying out the mission that they saw after the Civil War. If you look at this incredibly racist political cartoon from the time period, you can see what many of the critics of the Freedmen's Bureau saw as its purpose. We see an African American man in the cartoon who's sort of laying around not doing anything, where in the background you see white people doing all the work. And if you read the text of this cartoon, it says, support Congress and you support the Negroes, sustain the president and you protect the white man. Sort of pitting blacks and whites against each other and saying that the radical Republicans are only interested in helping African Americans at the expense of whites. Clearly it was not this zero sum. If one group was helped, the other group was hurt. But this was the central debate, and the Freedmen's Bureau is the first place where that picks up. The radical Republicans are at Johnson's throat because he seems seemingly blocking all their ideas. Despite the fact that Johnson vetoes it, the radical Republicans in Congress override his veto. They get a 2/3 majority, and they pass the Reconstruction Acts. This caused a military occupation of the South. So if you look at this map, you can see the states that were the Confederate states. Those Confederate states were divided into military districts, and a general of the Union Army was put in charge of each of those military districts. This meant that Union soldiers were in towns and cities in the South, enforcing the law, and thus protecting the rights of newly freed slaves. The only way that these troops would withdraw from the South was if Southern states ratified the 14th and 15th Amendment to the Constitution. The 14th Amendment to the Constitution said that all citizens have equal rights, particularly on the basis of race. And the 15th Amendment said that all black men had the right to vote. It said you could not discriminate against someone based on their race. This was not something that most Southern states were willing to agree with. But in order to become states again, they had to, and get the Northern troops out of their territory, they had to pass these constitutional amendments. This meant that Union troops stayed in the South for a number of years after the Civil War. And those Union troops were there, and while they were there, they were protecting the rights of the African Americans who'd recently been freed. As sort of a side note, this is not important on that story, but it's related. Andrew Johnson so gets in the way of the ideas of the radical Republicans that they accuse him of breaking the law and they impeach him. He's the first president who is ever impeached. If you remember from our conversation during our government unit, impeached means when the president is put on trial in the Senate by a vote of the House of Representatives. Andrew Johnson was impeached by the House of Representatives. He was put on trial in the Senate. They were one vote away from removing him from office. If one more senator had voted against him, he would have been removed from office, and the vice president would have become the president. When they're one vote short of removing him from office, he kind of backs off some of his demands and gives in to the radical Republicans. At that point, it's the end of his term anyway, and not much else was going to be accomplished. But you can see that for the radical Republicans, this was a big, important issue, and they blame Johnson for getting in their way and slowing things down. to the point where they almost removed him from office. During the Reconstruction period, when Union troops are in the southern states, so this is, we would say, 1866 or so after the Civil War up until 1877, life for African Americans is at least a little, depending on how you would look at it, but in some ways substantially better. African American men have the right to vote, and that right is protected because there are Union soldiers there making sure that they can get to the ballot box and cast votes. We have the first African Americans elected to the Senate and to the House of Representatives during this time period. So Blanche K. Bruce, a former slave, is elected as a senator from Mississippi. A lot of people don't know that this is part of our country's history. They think that it's much more recently that we've had African Americans elected after the Civil Rights Movement. But during this time, during Reconstruction, where African Americans' rights were protected and they could vote, in many states like Mississippi, they were the majority of the population, and that allowed African Americans to get elected officials, to have African American governors, African American mayors, in many different places around the country. This also allows for an education system to be created, and there isn't really a lot of segregation yet, because that, as we'll see, comes after Reconstruction ends. So life is getting better for African Americans, and it seems like the country is doing the things necessary to help integrate former slaves, freedmen, into our country. But there are many people who feel like this is moving too fast, and the old racist ideas, especially in the South, but in the North as well, they don't go away that quickly. Many African Americans are forced, once they're freed from slavery, into a system of sharecropping. Sharecropping essentially forced through contracts former slaves to continue working as farmers on the land of their former slave masters. We'll be talking more about this in class, but it's not slavery, but it's essentially similar to slavery, and it catches and traps a lot of African Americans in the South. The KKK, the Ku Klux Klan, is an organization that was created in the South during the Reconstruction period specifically to try to scare African Americans from exercising their rights and keep them out of doing things like voting and getting an education and going on to push for better employment. This Ku Klux Klan, because they couldn't use the laws as they had previously during slavery, uses violence to try to intimidate and scare African Americans. When the Northern Army is in the southern states, they can protect African Americans from groups like the Ku Klux Klan who are trying to scare the African Americans. When the Northern Army leaves, things are going to change substantially. Lynching becomes a very, very common thing after the Civil War during this time period, because African Americans who were seen as breaking the old social norms, even if they weren't the laws, could be punished in public with murder as a way to show that the old stereotypes were going to be enforced even if the law didn't reflect them. Reconstruction continues up through most of the 1870s. Some southern states are slowly becoming states again because they're passing these constitutional amendments. But there are specific states in the South where I think three, Florida, Louisiana, and I forget the third off the top of my head, where the Southerners still are resisting and not wanting to become part of the country again. As this is going on, we have a very, very, very close presidential election. In 1876, the two candidates were a Republican named Rutherford B. Hayes and a Democrat named Samuel Tilden. This election was a disaster. It was close in much of the country between the two candidates, but we had massive, massive cheating in the South, and people using violence to keep both blacks and whites from trying to exercise their vote. And it was so bad that in some of the southern states, it wasn't clear who won the election at all because the cheating was so rampant. People were voting multiple times. People were being shot at to keep them from voting. It was very unclear who won those states. And those states ended up being the electoral votes necessary to determine who would win the election. As we were getting closer to Inauguration Day in 1877, the country didn't know who was going to be the president because both Hayes and Tilden had said that they were going to win. The leaders of both political parties sat down, and just days before the inauguration, they made a deal. They allowed the Republican Rutherford B. Hayes to become president. But in exchange for that, Rutherford B. Hayes had to agree to end Reconstruction, had to agree to remove the Northern troops from the South, bringing the Reconstruction period to a close. This is commonly known as the Compromise of 1877. When the Union troops leave, the attention of the country is not on the South. The Northern politicians stop talking about this as a major issue. The South is sort of left to itself in order to determine how it wants to govern race relations. And as we know, that leads to segregation and disaster for the African American populations in the South. Jim Crow is the commonly used term to refer to what segregation is like, and there are a number of different laws passed in the southern states that specifically are designed to first disenfranchise African Americans and keep them from voting, but also to then enforce segregation in public places. Sometimes we think that segregation happened immediately after the Civil War, and that is not true. During Reconstruction, African Americans' rights were protected. It's not until the 1880s that segregation becomes enforced in the South that we get this massive distinction between the equality of whites and the equality of African Americans. The Supreme Court case that sort of puts this firmly into the Constitution is called Plessy versus Ferguson. That doesn't happen until 1896, saying that separate but equal schools and other facilities for blacks and whites is constitutional. It's not until Brown versus Board of Education in 1954 that Plessy versus Ferguson is going to be overturned. So if we were going to chart the rights of African Americans during this time period, what we would see is African Americans' rights are protected after the Civil War. It's not perfect, but they have a number of rights. And then it's at the end of Reconstruction that we begin the downslope for African American rights that we see during the period of segregation before the Civil Rights Movement. Any questions you have about this, come to class with, and we will gladly talk about them on Thursday.